Do you ever wonder why we have this great wall where we're on this side in the public realm and God's on the other side, and we're kind of not supposed to go to the other side, especially in the public space? You know, I think about in politics, you can talk just about anything, but as soon as you start trying to bring in God as a source for morals or biblical ethics, then, whoa, people kind of go nuts about that. And then I think in the educational realm, it doesn't matter if you're kindergarten or up there working on a PhD, there's just this tendency to search for explanations from a naturalistic perspective. You can talk all day long about dinosaurs. You can talk about the Big Bang. You can talk about the march of progress as man went from an amoeba up to a monkey, up to a man. But if you try to bring in, God said, let there be light, or in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, well, you'll get some resistance on that. And, this has taken on kind of a quasi-religious intensity. I mean, you've always had religious people, but now those who push the secular or the naturalistic paradigm are equally as intense in their zealousness. It almost has a religious intensity. Well, how did we get here? Of course, there's lots of explanations, and one is just the general march of humanism and wealth of man. Of course, there's the whole scientific paradigm, the scientific explosion that started about 400 or so years ago and resulted in the theory of evolution. But as far as this having this religious quality to it, a lot of that is attributable to one man. It is because of this man right here, Immanuel Kant. And he was a philosopher who lived about, 250 years ago or so. Here's a book that he wrote, Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone, sometimes called Religion Within the Bounds of Reason. And this alone tells you right here that, wait a minute, here's a philosopher commenting on religion and saying basically that based on reason, you have to restrict religion. Well, but wait a minute, I thought that was the domain of theologians, not so much philosophers. Well, the reason he got to this point, this book is actually a product of a book that he wrote before that, and this is his seminal work right here. It's called The Critique of Pure Reason. And this has largely resulted in what we have today. This is a large reason why we have this wall of separation. Now, what does he do in this book? Well, he does a lot in this book, but the center of his thought, the kernel out of which modernism and postmodernism sprung, is basically this. You can't really know the outside world because of the immediate senses, what we feel, what we taste, what we see, what we hear, because of the immediate nature of those. For example, I see this book, but the book is not really in my head. It's the light waves that come to my retina and then get turned into an electrical impulse, and Lord knows what happens from that, and somehow it gets into my mind. And Kant, drawing much on the philosophy of David Hume, said, well, because of these things, because of the immediate nature of our senses, we really don't really know what that is. And we really don't know if it exists. But what we do know is what we think about it. And that is what is the most real thing. Well, Kant took it from there, and in so many convoluted words, he plays cat and mouse with his readers. But essentially, he comes to the point where he says that the objects of our experience are actually created by the mind. The reality's not there. The reality's in here. Some of his direct followers in philosophy, that's how they took it. And they said that, well, if reality's not out there, including the God that's out there and Jesus Christ and the Bible, that stuff that's out there, if reality's not here, but it's in here, well, that means that God is not there. God is in here. And that's why today naturalism and this wall of separation that insists that whether you're in the education system or you're doing politics, that everything has to be reasoned naturally. You cannot appeal to the supernatural. And the reason that has become a quasi-religion in itself as much because of this idea that God is within. Well, the question is Kant right? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so I hope you stay with me through this. But let me just say a couple things, though, that I don't think he could be right. Because, first of all, in his most important points that he makes, that he acknowledges as the most important points in the book, it's almost unreadable. And a lot of people since the beginning have thought the same thing. As a matter of fact, Kant gave his manuscript way back then to a good friend of his, Marcus Hertz, to review. And Hertz returned it half unread, saying that he could not go on because otherwise he'd go insane. And I kind of relate to that. But another reason is because the book is essentially self-refuting. And what I mean by that is that Kant all but says that you really can't really know things, the true essence of things, not just out there, but also in here, as what he calls the thing in itself, the Ding an sich. You cannot know that. And yet, Kant claims in this book to basically know everything about knowing. Well, if you can't know anything, then how can you know everything? So it is self-refuting. And we're going to talk about many other things here, but let me first introduce myself, and I'll do that over here. All right. Well, welcome everybody. And I hope that you'll enjoy this little expose on Immanuel Kant. My name is Eric Engleman, and quite a long time ago I was in the Navy, naval officer in the aviation side of things, and then I was an airline pilot for quite a few years. And then I did a whole bunch of study, mostly theological, some philosophical, and I studied at Talbot School of Theology in Los Angeles. And I also studied for a few years over in Vienna, Austria at the university there. Well, during this extended time of study, I saw again and again this need or this desire in the academic realm to make our studies with only considering naturalistic explanations, not supernatural. Even in the conservative realm, there was this tendency to look for naturalistic explanations. And as a part of that, as justification for why things needed to be that way, the name of Immanuel Kant kept on coming up again and again and again. So he has been a very important figure in the process that has led to our current secularism, the modernism in the modern age, and then the postmodernism that we have now. I'm not the only one who thinks that Kant was really a big deal here. Many others have thought this through the years, and I got just a few quotes here I'd like to read. The first one is from Will Durant, who was a major historian, and he said this: "Philosophy will never again be so naive as in her earlier days and simpler days. She must always be different hereafter and profounder because Kant lived." Wow. That's quite a testimony. Professor Daniel Robinson, he had worked at Oxford as a philosophy professor, told his students at the beginning of a course of the Critique of Pure Reason, he said this: "Kant wrote perhaps the greatest metaphysical treatise ever composed." Now, President McCosh, back 100 and some years ago, President McCosh of Princeton College back then, now it's Princeton University, knew a lot about this Kantian idealism that was coming in and that it was hostile to the faith. So President McCosh thought that John Locke, the empiricist philosopher John Locke, was the most influential metaphysician of the last century, and Immanuel Kant was the most influential metaphysician of this century, that is the 1800s. President McCosh also said that there is a need of a rebellion against Kant's despotic authority. And we're going to be talking about that despotic authority here in a little while. All right, Ayn Rand, a couple of generations ago, an objectivist philosopher, said this: "If you trace the roots of our modern philosophies, such as pragmatism, logical positivism, and all the rest of the neo-mystics who announce happily that you cannot prove that you exist, you will find that they all grew out of Kant. And I would say ditto Dagobert Ruins in my pictorial history of philosophy. He said this: all modern philosophy must orient itself to Kant. Notice the word must. And finally, the last quote I'll read you is from Professor Cornelius Van Til, who about 100 years ago was a theology professor at the Princeton Seminary, just about the time when the effect of Immanuel Kant was coming in, and this resistance against the Christian faith and a adherence to the naturalistic paradigm was taking on a religious zeal. Van Til said this: finally, both the present-day followers of Calvin and the present-day followers of Kant know that the struggle between the two Christs is a struggle to the death. It is the battle of Armageddon that is now being waged between them, and every man is involved in it. When Van Til speaks about Calvin here, really what he's speaking of is fundamental or orthodox Christianity. Of course, Christianity is Christ. So what he's comparing here is two Christs. One, Jesus Christ, and the other one, Immanuel Kant. Now, he doesn't use these words, but if you will, an antichrist of sorts. And he says that there's a mother of all battles being waged between them, and every man is involved in it. And I would certainly agree with Van Til that every man is in fact involved with it. I started out a few minutes ago speaking about this wall of separation, where in politics, you kind of get in trouble if you start bringing in your religion, especially biblical religion, or in the public school system, talking about dinosaurs and the Big Bang and all of us evolving from little amoeba up to monkeys to us. You can talk all about that, but if you try to talk about the biblical God who is there, then you tend to get in some trouble and you may even lose your job. So we are all involved in it today. And it reminds me of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall, remember that? Some 50, 60 years ago that they built. It was to keep the people, the East Germans, who were then communist under the thumb of communist Russia or the Soviets. It wasn't meant to keep people out of East Germany. It was meant to keep the East German people in. The communists did not want their people seeing what was on the other side of the wall. And by the way, that wall is an indirect result of the philosophy of Immanuel Kant through communism. So the people were trapped, and their leaders did not want them to see what was on the other side of the wall, which happened to be better things. And it's the same way with the wall we have now. Many of our leaders don't think that it's good for us to see what's on the other side of the wall. They say that, well, you can't see anything anyway on the other side of the wall. And yet, we have eternity in our hearts. We are aware of our mortality, and we're at least aware of the concept of God. People say they believe in God, but everybody is aware of the concept of God. Well, how did that get there? Well, we're going to talk about how the philosophy of Immanuel Kant got us to this point, and we're going to analyze Kant's philosophy, mainly as depicted here in the Critique of Pure Reason, and some very important parts, which are right in the first part of the book, where he establishes his epistemology. And as we do this, as we proceed through this expose, I'd like you, especially if you're students, I'd like you to ponder this, that if you are going to base your rejection of God on what this man said in this book, then ponder this. Shouldn't it be clear? Shouldn't he make a good case that you need to exclude the God out there, the biblical God? I would hope you would think to yourself, okay, he has to make a very good case. His case has to be clear. There has to be defined and clear terms and a process of argumentation. But if there isn't, why should you roll the dice and bet your eternal destiny on somebody who really does not make the case that you should reject the God out there? In fact, we all live and we all die. And if that God does exist, then it would only make sense that our eternal destiny is in his hands. So ponder these things as we proceed forward here. Now, the first thing we're going to cover is just a little bit of a background history, not so much of Kant, but the philosophical history that preceded him. And not just of going back 100 years or 200 years, but going back to the very beginning. That philosophy didn't start with Kant. It didn't start with the Greeks. It started with God. All right, well, welcome. And we're going to talk a little bit about Immanuel Kant, but before we do that, we're going to cover a little bit of philosophical history to try to put things a little bit in context. But let me first say I really appreciate Estevan Malizio, who is doing the filming today, and his company PowerCrownedStudios.com. And so he's the man behind the camera today. All right, so we'll take it away. Now, when did philosophy begin? Well, if you go to a philosophy course over at the community college or just about anywhere else, they'll start talking about the Greeks. By the way, you might wonder about this eye patch. I don't wear it because I have a plastic eye or a bad eye. I wear it because my eyeball muscles are weak. And sometimes, like right now, sometimes I can't keep my eyes lined up. It's actually what took me out of flying 20 years ago. So I'll go cross-eyed or my eyes will go like this. And it's just, I see double. And so instead of seeing two of each of you, it's better for me to put on the eye patch. All right. So, philosophy, Greeks. Well, philosophy didn't start with the Greeks. Philosophy started a long time before that. If you go to the first page of the Bible, there's a little bit of skepticism going on there right at the beginning. You know, the first words of the Bible are God created the heavens. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Bereshith Elohim bara, the heavens and the earth. And so there you have a brute fact. And then the first page of the Bible goes on to say that he created everything that's on the earth. And he created mankind, men, women, and so on and so forth. And God, you know, there was, in God's economy, it was wonderful. There in the Garden of Eden, it was total freedom, but there was one law, and that was don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, the first skeptic came along, the serpent, the devil, the evil one, also known as Satan, the deceiver. And what did he say? What did he say to Eve there? He said, did God really say? Did God really say that you shouldn't eat, or he said, touch that fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And right there, he's cast out. Not about the world, not about the mind of man, but about the metaphysical, the ultimate things, God. You know, did God really say? And so there you have the first skeptic. And of course that had a bad effect. Eve ate the forbidden fruit, and Adam and Eve were thrown out of the garden as a result, and death came into the world. So there you have a little bit of doubting one of the realities, in fact the most important reality, God. And it had a terrible effect right at the beginning, and that effect continues right to this present day. Death and sin and evil and murder and mayhem continue to be a part of our world. So now, as far as philosophy goes, well, heck, 500 years before the first Greek philosophers, you have Solomon. If you turn in the Bible to the book of Ecclesiastes, the Solomon, who was, by the way, known as the wisest man in the world, he wrote the Proverbs, and he knew hundreds and hundreds of proverbs. He wrote also hundreds of songs, but in the book of Ecclesiastes, he undertakes an experiment to try to live life to its fullest, to experience all he can in life, to learn all he can in life, but to do it with the assumption that the agency of God is not there. Well, the results weren't too good for Solomon. He said that ultimately he found out that everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Sometimes in some Bible versions called vanity, vanity, vanity. All is vanity. His conclusion of that was that the ultimate duty of man was to fear God and to keep his commandments. As we'll see on down the line here, as Immanuel Kant degrades the idea of the metaphysical, the ultimate meanings in life, the reason for being, and ultimately God, then things go downhill fast, and there's just less worth living for. All right, so my point there is just to say that there was a lot of philosophy going on long before the Greeks. Well, so let's talk about the Greeks for a moment. Who is it? Thales. Thales there on of Miletus is considered to be the first philosopher, and there were other philosophers at that time along what is the western coast of present-day Turkey, and they started a project which continues to this day, which was sort of like the devil at the beginning there, is to say, okay, let's minimize, any natural concept of God or gods, of the ultimate meaning of things. But let's just, using our mind, let's look into the physical things of the world and try to look for the cause of things, not in God, but in the nature itself. If a volcano erupts, all right, let's kind of leave God off the shelf or out of the causal chain for the moment here, and let's just look for a naturalistic explanation. Maybe there's something under the earth causing these volcanoes to go up. And so philosophy among the Greeks there got started. Philosophy means a friend of wisdom, But this was not like philosophers like Solomon before taught. Solomon was a friend of wisdom, philosophos, a friend of wisdom, but he determined that if you're going to be a friend of wisdom, you have to include all these things, but especially the most meaningful things in the universe, that is, starting with God. Only then are you a friend of wisdom. The fool has said in his heart, as his father said, David, by the way, this is a bust of David. David said, the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. David knew that if you say there is no God, then the whole reason for being just evaporates and life becomes meaningless and a chasing after the wind. Now, while the Greeks got started off on a somewhat anti-metaphysical start, in the main, it didn't continue that way. Yes, in the pre-Socratic time, there were philosophers like Pyrrho, Zeno, and others that were extremely skeptical. And some actually doubted that you could know anything or know the reality of things. But still, in the center of Greek, or the center of the flow of philosophy through the Greek times and on into the Roman times, there was the main concern with what is real, and how is their interaction, cause and effect among the real things. What is real? Is it the main reality in the world, the main reality in the mind of man? Maybe I should squeeze my own head for that. Or the main reality in God, or gods, or ultimate meaning of things. And this is what the Greeks were dealing with. It's what we deal with today. It's what Immanuel Kant dealt with. Now, it's very important where you go with this, because if you decide one thing or another, it has ramifications in how that person lives his or her life. And if they are a powerful person, it has ramifications on society. When we come to Socrates, about 400 years before Christ, you could say that he was a skeptic, in as much as he said that, hey, we should keep the conversation going. Socrates didn't like conclusions. He liked to ask questions. And in his dialogues, in his asking of questions, he would have his people who he was dialoguing with come to certain conclusions, but then he would challenge those conclusions. So it was a form of skepticism, in that he said, well, let's consider that, and let's pick that apart, and let's just not settle on that. Now, this was very different than where Immanuel Kant finally arrived, because he, after his enterprise in the critique of pure reason, Kant ended up saying that, okay, this is the final word. This critique of what pure reason is, and as a little teaser in the front here, I'll tell you that what Kant was really doing is using pure reason to make the critique. So it's sort of a circular reasoning sort of thing. But he said this is the last words. Everything to do with metaphysics has been solved, and it's just a work to be done. And it's now not a theory, it's a tribunal that will judge all further speculation. Well, now, Socrates would have frowned on that, because he said, no, you don't stop there, you keep on going. But as far as where Socrates really settled, it's made evident in what he said at his trial. Because he liked to keep the conversation going and challenge conclusions and pronouncements and decrees, well, that put him kind of on the wrong side of not just fellow philosophers, but on the wrong side of the politicians there in Athens. And so they brought him up on charges, ironically, charges of disrespecting the gods. But when he knew that they were going to condemn him to death, Socrates said, just to paraphrase this in essence, that, okay, you guys do what you have to do, but in the end, I know that I've done right under God. I've searched after truth, and in the end, God is going to judge us all. So, that's not exactly a man who's a total skeptic. All right, well, beyond him, Plato, his student, or maybe he was the man who put words into Socrates' mouth, we're not sure about that. But Plato emphasized more this side of things, the mind and the ideas, these forms that are, you could say, that are in the mind of God. That's where his emphasis was. And then his student, Aristotle, emphasized, no, we kind of have to stick with what we can feel, taste, and touch, and we kind of have to then move from there on up to higher things. All right. Well, this is the way things kind of remained through the Roman times until we get towards the end of the Roman times, when the Christianity became legalized and then kind of became the state religion, and then the Catholic Church, and along with the Greek Orthodox churches came to the ascendancy, and in that time, the emphasis shifted over here, of course, to ultimate causes and to God. All right. As we come out of the Middle Ages, because the church had become very powerful and had become a bit bossy in some ways, there was many thinkers itched to once again express what they thought where reality was, either in the mind or over here in the world. And so we come to the Reformation. And the Reformation was interesting because it's at heart, it's not a humanist enterprise. The Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, was a movement of Christians, starting with people like John Hus in Prague, Ulrich Zwingli, Martin Luther, and others who said, some of the things the church has done has been too much lording it over others. The church, through using their reason, in some ways, the Roman Catholic Church has tended to put reason above the pronouncements of Scripture. And so we need to go back and let man, using his own freedom that God gives us, using that freedom to study the Word on his own, not based on what leaders in the church are saying he must believe with theology and the doctrines of the faith, but a man should be free to look on his own, in his own language, and decide for himself what God requires of him. Now that was the reformers were pushing for freedom, and so there was not just Christians that wanted freedom. There were people that weren't so friendly to the Christian religion that wanted freedom too. They wanted freedom to go back to start let's really look at what's going on in the mind. Let's look at what's really in the world. And so out of the Reformation, a movement of humanism also sprang up. Now, this then flowed into a time called the Enlightenment, much because of the freedom brought about through the Reformation. Then people could shine their own lights and more think and come up with ideas like they wanted to. There was, in their eyes, there was more light, the Enlightenment. All right. Now, much can be said about the Enlightenment. And when we say Enlightenment, we're kind of more thinking about thinkers, about philosophy. And because the church had they had a little bit of a leash on how far philosophers could go with their thinking about the mind and the world, there was a little bit of pent-up energy there. And so once those restraints were taken off, there was an explosion of thinking and knowledge. Now, let me oversimplify where things went from here, and in the context of what Immanuel Kant was dealing with. The Enlightenment brought, among other things, two significant strains of thinking. One was empiricism, and that kind of started with a English statesman and thinker and naturalist, Francis Bacon. And he kind of was the father of the empiricist movement. There were antecedents in this way back in Greek times. But Bacon put the emphasis on the world. He said, there's been all kinds of ideas how we should pursue truth, what's really real. And I think that Bacon said that we should look at the world, the things in the world, do naturalistic, scientific studies of the things of the world, and then that will then lead us inductively to say, okay, because these sort of things in the world, that then that goes into the human mind, and then the human mind tells us, then can reach up to the stars and maybe decide some things about final meaning and God, etc., etc. Then there were the rationalists, more or less starting with René Descartes, who said, no, that's not where it's at. We need to start with first principles in the mind. And for him, the first principle was, when he boiled all the water out of the mental pot, he decided that the first thing in the mind was the brute fact that he thinks. This is René Descartes. I think, okay, well, if I'm thinking, I can deduce from that I am, at least I am. I don't know if the world is or God is, but at least I am. And from there, we can deduce other facts about the world and about God. That was called rationalism. Over here, empiricism, rationalism. Well, things went along pretty good for a while, but with empiricism, they started to have their problems on that side, especially by the time you get to David Hume, who things started to get very skeptical about what you can really know by starting with things in the world. Over here in the rationalistic side there, it didn't take long for things to run off into pantheism with Baruch Spinoza. And then some once it went through that, and you have a philosopher named Gottfried von Leibniz, who very much attached things to believe that you could use reason to argue to higher things and to God. He came up with a very strange notion that everything in the mind and in the world and anything that has to do with higher meanings are actually corpuscles, what he called monads, of actually God's mind. Well, Immanuel Kant inherited all this. And so by the time he comes along the scene in the mid to later 1700s, things are a bit of a mishmash. And so Kant decides for himself that he's going to solve things once and for all. Now, Immanuel Kant grew up and lived and taught in Prussia, East Prussia. Now, back then, what we know as Poland now and the very western parts of Russia were actually German-speaking, largely. They called it Prussia, and they had their own king in the earlier part of Kant's life. The king was Frederick, sometimes called Frederick the Great, because he expanded the territory greatly. And he was King Frederick was a bit of a thinker himself, but he brought into his court people, some okay, but others like Voltaire from France, where much of the French Enlightenment took a very skeptical turn, and Voltaire and others were very mocking of the church and the ideas of that there's ultimate meaning in God. So Immanuel Kant lived up there on the shores of the icy Baltic Sea, a city called Königsberg. Königsberg, King's Hill, Königsberg, King's Hill. And now the city is known as Kaliningrad. And it's actually in a little enclave, a separated enclave of Russia. It's surrounded by independent nations like Latvia, and I think Belarus is down there somewhere. But that's where Kant lived for almost all of his life. He only seldom did he venture away from there. And he worked as an unpaid professor for quite a number of years, but he finally got a paid job there at the university. And he very quickly began immersing himself in these higher big discussions that would have societal impact. And so by the time he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, he was already well versed in a lot of the issues of the age, the issues of empiricism and the issues of rationalism. And he was more in the rationalistic strain, but very much influenced especially by the empiricist David Hume and his skeptical take of things that we'll talk about in a moment. But Kant, by the time he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, he was a highly respected and quite a well-known philosopher in his own right. So what did Kant basically do? What did he basically do in his mind to really put all future philosophy and metaphysics and speculation and their results on a permanent, solid footing that would always be the standard for the future? Again, Socrates would have rolled over in his grave thinking, oh man, somebody pronounced that they had solved everything. And Kant actually says that in the Critique, that all metaphysical questions have been solved. Well, to put things crudely, and in a way more than what Kant said himself, although this is how many thinkers thought that where Kant finally went, and some of his most able and influential direct followers took him to say, and it's this, that, okay, you have the three main things in the world, right? The world, the mind of man, and God or God, so the ultimate meaning of things. And the question about how they interact, that had been the age-old question. Okay, if the world is here, well, how in the world does it get into the mind of man? Or if God's out here as the transcendent God, how can the God actually get into the mind of man? And how can man's thinking influence God or the world? All right, Kant solved that by basically bringing the world into man. The world is not really out there, it's really in the mind of man, a creation of the mind of man. And the same could be said, but in a more abstract way, with ultimate reason, with God, is that, in a manner of speaking, Kant brought all that into the mind of man. But in a way that's not so sure or plain, because you see, at least the mind of man has the senses, mainly the five senses, in order to interact with the world. So at least you got that. As unreliable as they are, at least you have that. And so that makes a connection here a little more sure than the connection here where the five senses don't have a connection there. And okay, and so that's Kant's basically his solution, that ultimately there's not three things, there's one thing, the mind of man. And that solves the cause and effect problems right there. Now, for the remainder of our time, we're going to look at Kant's justification of this in the Critique of Pure Reason, as far as I'm able to make it out. But this is mainly the project of the Critique of Pure Reason, is his justification of what I just said here. And it has much to do with the notion that the mind of man, through his consciousness, essentially lays things on the world, on metaphysical things, God. It's the mind of man laying these things on the rest of these realities that essentially brings them into existence. And it ultimately goes back to the the age-old question about, if a tree falls in the woods and somebody's not there, a mind is not there to sense it, does it really happen? And Kant, now he doesn't say this directly, but this is what you can infer from what he said, is that no, without a mind, a man there to see these things, to hear these things, to be aware of that tree falling in the woods, then for us, when we are all we know, for us, it may as well, we can consider that it just doesn't happen. All right, so let's look now at a little bit of what Immanuel Kant teaches in mainly the first 100 pages of the Critique of Pure Reason, because that's where this justification happens. Most of the rest of the critique is just saying, based on what he has decided here, that the mind of the man is a measure of all things, then what does that mean for other things, about the world, about concepts of God, about arguments of God, etc., etc. So let's take a look at that now. All right. So Immanuel Kant is going to tell us where the reality is and how the things of the world interact. And the reality is going to end up in the mind. The world is there, the metaphysical is there, and that's how they can interact with each other. Now, so this is more or less where he ends, although I must warn you that, and Kant does not tell us this, but as he goes about his project in the Critique of Pure Reason, he's already assuming this world. Now think about it. If you're living in this kind of world, okay, you might not be so sure about what the subject is and what the object is. If it's all kind of one, or when you're talking about God, is God a subject or object? Okay. Now the official thing that through a very strange question that Kant asks here, that I'll mention here in a moment, the thing he's trying to do is to show really what you can know, the limits of reason, critiquing pure reason, ultimately what you can know. Because in his mind, if we can figure out what we can really know, then that knowledge is what we will use for all future philosophizing, for all future religion, for all future governments in society, for the good of mankind. And so for him, right from the start, it's very important that the knowledge be very, very sure. And this goes back to Descartes. But being so sure about something that it's like necessary knowledge. It's like absolutely sure. Remember what Descartes said. Okay, and the one thing I can know for sure is that I think. I mean, that is indubitable. It's not dependent on any contingent knowledge or the senses. It's just automatically there. I think it's mathematical, therefore I am. It's almost like a mathematical equation. But with Kant, though, you still have the problem of the world and with these metaphysical things. So how can they be known? How can the world, or how can ultimate meanings, or angels, or God be known? And the way he asks this in the critique is this: how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Let me say that again. I had to think long and hard about what he was getting at here. How are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Okay, let's handle the first part of that. How are synthetic judgments, like a judgment, all right, when I reach out here and touch something in the world, an apple, a person, a cat, a caterpillar, it's a synthetic thing because you have the world, but then you have me. Two different things. I got to go out there through these mediate senses, these unreliable senses, and go out there, and there's a synthesis between that and whatever I bring to it. And Kant talks a lot about that, as we'll speak about here in a few minutes. So it's a synthesis. It's what the philosophers call a posteriori knowledge. A posteriori means from after, meaning from after experience. In other words, I experience this thing, oh, it feels smooth. And then, the synthesis from what I feel and what I think, then there's a synthesis there. And what I learn from that is kind of indirectly learned through these flawed senses. Now, let me take this opportunity to mention that Kant had trouble with the idea of this synthesis because the synthesis takes place through the flawed senses. You see, David Hume, as Kant said, woke Kant up from his dogmatic slumbers. And what he meant from that is that David Hume taught, like some of the Greek skeptics of old, he taught that, when you sense something through the human senses, it's not like the actual thing, not like the actual object in the world is in your head. No, it's, and this is Hume talking, it's you, for example, I see this globe. Well, okay, the globe is not in my head. It's actually the light that's from somewhere else reflects off the globe, and then that light, and who knows really what light is, it goes into my retina and it goes through an electrochemical process that then sends an electric pulse down back to the frontal lobes of the brain, and then goes through other complex processes that we know not what they are, and I end up with a picture in my mind of this globe. But as to what it really is, we don't know. And as to if it really exists, we don't know. Now, this is what Hume said. Now that woke Kant up from his dogmatic slumbers. In other words, where he had previously dogmatically thought that there's some way that we actually do have knowledge. Some of the philosophers around that time, like Thomas Reid, for example, a Scottish philosopher, taught that, all right, this may be sort of a mystery, but God makes it happen nevertheless. And by the way, I believe that that's really the case. But Hume said, no, you really don't know what it is, and you don't really know if it really exists. So that sent Kant on a refurbished quest to say, okay, if that is so, then there must be some way to really know these things. And so going back to his question, how are synthetic judgments, in other words, my judgment about what I sense in the world, the synthesis, what I judge about that, how can we know that it's not a posteriori knowledge, in other words, after sense, but actually a priori knowledge? A priori means from before. From before what? From before sensation. I mean, wait a minute, it's kind of a crazy question. It's like saying, well, how can you sense something without sensing it? Or how do you have a posteriori knowledge is actually a priori knowledge? Well, Kant believes that this is possible. By this question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? By this question, he telegraphs that he already has the answer. And the answer will be that we can know objects a priori, that is necessarily, like mathematically, absolutely what they are. And this is really to put it more bluntly than Kant does, that we can know objects a priori, because the objects are really not out there, but in the mind. There's really no gap. There's really not a synthesis. It seems like it's synthesis based on our sensation, but actually it's what is in our minds that we'll talk about here in a moment, and that's what Kant spends a lot of time on, is enough of a projection of our own minds upon the world that you may as well say, well, that's just a projection of our minds. Now, Kant doesn't come right out and say that, but he all but says that. And some of those, his fellow philosophers at that time basically said that, and certainly some of his followers did. All right. So he, in the critique of pure reason, will demonstrate that this is the fact, that these two are not actually two, they're actually one. And that these two are not actually two, but they're really one. But really what happens in this process, it's not, where does the reality go? Well, it kind of fades away from this, and you wonder, well, is there anything out there left over once this is all done? And the same thing over here with higher meanings, the metaphysical, God. It's not like he moves the transcendent biblical God into the mind. No, it just kind of disappears. Now, later, Kant will, in his other two critiques that he wrote after the critique of pure reason, based on these primary feelings in the mind of man and a sense of morality that man has, and other reasons, he will position a God that it's out there, but it's very subjective, and a God that you can't really say anything about other than what you feel subjectively, because you can't allow this gap. You can't have a God that's out there who speaks to Moses, and then Moses records his law, and then Christ comes along and raises from the dead, and that history is recorded in a book called the Bible that's out there. It's not allowed. But what will be eventually allowed is a very subjective God, but God is all but destroyed in the first critique, the critique of pure reason. All right. So how does Kant move all this into the mind? Or maybe better to say it, how does the mind produce all this? Well, first of all, Kant talks about time and space. Time and space. And this is, again, just in the first few pages of the critique, in a section called the Transcendental Aesthetic, he talks about space and time. Let me handle time first. When a man, I'll just put it in the first person, when I see something in the world, when I see a dog chasing a cat, for example, I see it as one event happening upon another through my awareness of passing events, which necessarily means that I have to have some element of human awareness, self-awareness and awareness of the things around me. So it's me that is aware of, oh, the dog is chasing the cat, and then the cat is turning around to chase the dog. And I sense it in as a passing events, one thing upon another. That's what I sense. But that sense of passing time is not out there. It's in me. It's only a function of human rational consciousness. And so Kant argues that, hey, it's not what we take, through common sense to be in the world is not actually in the world. It's in me, time. Now, how about space? All right. Well, as a human being, I look out there and I see a window. Beyond that, I see trees blowing in the wind. And here I see a globe. And I see space in between them. But what is space? Well, it's an absence of things. It's no thing. If it's no thing, well, it can't really exist as something independent of my mind that does perceive something, this emptiness between objects of my experience. But as far as space actually existing out there, you can't really say that it does. So between space and time, it shows us that much of how we perceive the world is something that we are imposing upon what we perceive. All right. Now things get interesting. Kant goes on after the transcendental aesthetic. Kant goes on in a section called the analytic of concepts, and then beyond that in what he calls deductions of the categories of the understanding. What he does here is tries to show that there are human concepts. Now, the highest order of these concepts he calls categories. They are pre-existing mental concepts necessary to make sense out of objects. And I'm going to be explaining this as I go along. In beginning here, and then in his what he calls the deduction of these categories, these higher level concepts, he calls it a deduction. But what it means, he means that his justification of them, his evidence that they really do exist. And because they exist, it shows that even more than space and time, it shows us that so much of how we think about the world is actually a product of our own minds. Now, these concepts, which are based upon these categories, Kant mentions the categories of the philosopher Aristotle, two and plus change 1,000 years before him. Now Aristotle was a real thinker. As I mentioned earlier, he concentrated on things of the world in order to determine what's up here. Like, based on his view of the world, he just said that, okay, because of things that the cause and effect that you see down here, that means there has to be an ultimate causer. He called it the prime mover. Well, one of the things Aristotle did was he tried to come up with a what can generally be said about all things in the world at the highest general level of generality, and no matter what they are, the things in the world. And he came up with a list it's tied to the world, and they are just general concepts like okay, you can say that something is there or it's not there. You can say that it has the ability to have properties of some kind, like redness or something like that. You can say that this thing can cause or is acted upon, things like this. Well, Kant took up on that, but he gave it a really cerebral spin. And actually, Kant critiques Aristotle for his basically kind of looking at things in the world and then trying to say, okay, what can generally be said about those things in the world? But Kant starts with laws of logic in order to come up with these general categories, as he said, of what can be said about everything. Well, his starting point is not the world. His starting point is logic. So that gives it a very heady, cerebral, brainy feel to it. And then he lists his categories, and Estevan will show those categories in a slide here as I'm speaking, and several of them are really hard to discern what Kant is really talking about. As you can see, there's four main headings, and then 3 separate categories under each main heading. And what do we make of these? Well, I'll be honest that some of them are inscrutable to me, and it's been very, very hard to find any information. Very few sources that I've found have been willing to try to describe what these really are. And Kant didn't either, as I'll speak about here in a moment. But there are a few here that do seem to be kind of like what Aristotle was speaking about. For example, let me get this some pens here. You could say, for example, that. All right, well, what do you say about these things? Okay, well, that they can be known as objects can be known as an aggregate and actually have some kind of property as the aggregate, pin set or something like that. But you can also make discern that there is individuality in a set, and where an individual may have a certain property and a certain function, but I know somehow that it's automatically that it's really there. It's not a dream. It's not fake. It's there. I know that this pen caused that pen to have an effect, and somehow I'm not confused. In fact, this pen wasn't the cause, and this was the effect. I somehow have this automatic conception or category of cause and effect in my mind. Well, of course, you could go on in my book here that describes a lot of the things I'm talking about. The Slaves of Immanuel Kant. I go into some more speculation about what each of the categories mean. But it's very difficult, even in these online encyclopedias, Stanford online encyclopedia of philosophy, and others. All they basically do is just repeat what Kant said. Okay, there's these categories, but really goes no further. By the way, in this book, what I do is this, similar to this, an expose on Kant, but Immanuel Kant. But then I show how his philosophy was kind of the final radical force that pushed Christian faith out of the first colleges in America. You know, in the history of our nation, all the colleges, you know, there may be one or two exceptions out there, but in the first 200 years, all the colleges were there. They had a Christian basis. They were all like seminaries where everybody learned about all these things: God, the mind, the world. But when Kant's influence came along through the Romanticism movement of the late 1700s and then the early 1800s, and then the Hegelianism, in other words, the philosophy that came out of Kant that basically said, okay, if everything's in the mind, then that's where God must be. And that actually, in an ironic way, it ended up with spawning indirectly Marxism. Except Marx didn't say, no, it's not God. Everything's not one and it's not God. It's all material. But before Marx, these philosophers like Hegel, Fichte, and others who believed that, oh, you know, that's God is in here, and everything is in human history that's working out in history is divine. Well, that greatly affected the nature poets in America, Emerson, Thoreau, these kind of people who then had a great effect at bringing this into America, this idea of the divine within. That's when all this worship of nature got started, and when that took hold in the schools, the scholarly community, now this is towards the mid to the late 1800s, the scholarly community in these colleges, who were already quite influenced by the empiricism and the emphasis on science, in which what followed in the wakes of that was evolution and Darwinism, and the development of the species, you know, and this whole idea, and that was already very strong. But when the notion came along that, hey, the scientists' work, who were already buying into the theory of evolution, when the notion came that, hey, their work is not just a human work, it's a work of God, then that pushed Christian faith out of the colleges. And anyway, that's what this book is about. All right, so let me pick up here. So who knows really what general concepts Kant is referring to here? These may indeed be the most general things one can say about the objects of sense, but what about all the other more specific things that one can say? Like, for example, not just the general concept of cause and effect, but like when a lightning bolt hits a building, but what about the lightning bolt? What about the building itself? What about the natural laws that are involved that cause the building to burn up once the lightning hits it? Well, that's where, if you were, you know, when we read these categories, these most generalities about what can be said about all that is, that Kant lists, you think, okay, well, let's fill in something of the lower order. I mean, because it's all got to be based on really things that are there, but Kant doesn't do it. He actually refuses to do that because it would take up more time and space. And this is from things that he says in the critique, and he basically says he doesn't, you know, that we are scientists. This is the Critique of Pure Reason is a book for experts. He doesn't want to get bogged down in trying to baby us too much. That it's made for experts in the philosophy trade. And actually, that if you wanted to fill up a fuller list of concepts that are in the human mind, not just these highest order ones, that we're on our own to find them ourselves. All right, Kant says here, and this is in his discussion of the table of categories, he said, I intentionally omit here the definitions of these categories, though I may be in possession of them. In the sequel, I shall dissect these concepts so far as is sufficient for the purpose of the method which I am preparing. Well, he never did dissect them. He left us out in the cold. He goes on, in a complete system of pure reason, they might be justly demanded. That is, to dissect the concepts and have a full accounting of them in the mind, not just the higher order ones. They might be justly demanded of him, but at present they would only make us lose sight of the principal object of our investigation by raising doubts and objections which, without injury to our essential object, may well be relegated to another time. So, you see, the thing is, if all you list is just what you can just super generally say about things, cause and effect, something's real, not real, it has a property, it all seems brainy. But if you fill up the rest of the concepts, the subcategories, if you will, then eventually you come down to the things in the world, those pens, the books, the light that's in my eyes, etc. And that's why Kant, in my mind, doesn't want to go any further here, because then it would, as he says, raise doubts and objections. Well, of course it would. That we're not talking about just things in the mind. We're talking about what the mind perceives out in the world. So I don't think that Kant plays fair there, unfortunately. But he's on a crusade to make the final philosophy. And so he's got to do what it takes to cut and smash, and that's what he does. So in order for Kant to accomplish all he has set out to do, but with the assumption from the start that God is kind of off limits, because in deference to Hume, because the things of sense you can't really know them, but and the things of sense, according to Kant, would include Bibles, Jesus rising from the dead, and those sort of things. Well, because it's through the immediate senses, you can't say much about that. But God is not something you can sense with the senses. So between those things, you pretty much, Kant's starting point pretty much shoves God off the out of the realm of epistemology, out of what can be known. So Kant will indeed solve the age-old problem or questions about what is real and how the three great realities, the world, the mind, and God, can affect each other. And he does this. He makes the man's mind the measure of all things, and makes the world and God manifestations of the mind. And so, voila, the world, mind, God are all real. I mean, because they exist in the mind, so really it's only the mind that's real. And because these are moved into the mind, then there's no space between them, and that's how they can affect each other. And this is an absolute miracle. Kant's finally done it. He's finally explained where ultimate reality is from, or where it exists. And he has now finally, for the first time in human philosophical history, explained how you can have interaction between the world and between God. But in Kant, in the process of doing this, in reality, there's nothing left. You see, if in Kant's starting place, if he says, okay, sort of like the very first Greek philosophers, making the same mistake as the devil right at the beginning, if he says, God is not something we can experience, we cannot experience through the senses, then we're going to start our process, our philosophical inquiry in the Critique of Pure Reason by just leaving him off to the side. But see, the problem is if you do that, like there in the Garden of Eden, things go down really quick. And with Immanuel Kant, it appears to be that there's really, after in trying to work his system, in order to make it work, there's really nothing left. You see, because it's not like Kant moves the world into the mind, it evaporates away. It's the concepts of the world that are in the mind, but as far as the world out there, it doesn't exist. And you could say the same thing with God. The thinker Heinrich Heine, about the time of Kant, or just after Kant's time, said of, as he called Kant, the arch destroyer of the realm of thought. Heine said that Kant stormed heaven and put the whole garrison to the sword. So he's speaking about this side. It ain't no more. Disappeared. And let me bring it back for you here. There we go. And regarding Kant's highest reality of the human ego, and this is something I've not talked about, by the way, but when Kant puts into doubt anything sensed by the senses, you see, Kant believes that, okay, the senses sense the world, right? And they also sense, the senses, the inner sense also senses the soul, the self. And Kant even puts that into doubt because it's something it's an inner sense, but as far as what it really is, or if it really exists, the soul, you can't really say anything about. So even that is put into doubt. William James, the philosopher, just back 100 plus years ago, he said that regarding what Kant said about the soul and the human ego, he said, it is simply nothing, as ineffectual and windy an abortion as philosophy can show. In other words, from that point, and that, by the way, kind of began that thought, this doubting of whether the soul is really there, set psychology and also sociology on the course of assuming that the soul is not there, that man is just a function of input and output, stimulus, response, but no real soul inside. And all the behaviorism and what John Dewey taught, and which resulted in our public education system, came from that thought. Speaking of education, James McCosh, who I cover at some length in my book here, because James McCosh was the president of Princeton College before it became a university back towards the late 1800s. And this is just when the German insanity, as one of his friends called it, was coming over. And James McCosh, who was the president of Princeton at that time when Immanuel Kant's philosophy was just being felt and putting pressure on the college to get rid of the supernatural, said that Kant, quote, kindled a conflagration which left nothing but ashes and mounds behind. Well, from from my read of the Critique of Pure Reason, I agree with what McCosh said, and not just him. Several of the presidents there and other professors at these schools really battled against the Kantian philosophy because they knew it was very hostile to the Christian faith. So I agree with McCosh that Kant, epistemologically speaking, as far as what can be known about knowledge or what can be known, he left nothing but ashes and mounds behind. He stormed heaven and put it to the sword, and he also stormed earth and put it to the sword. Regarding Kant's quest to know the real nature of things, real knowledge gained from the objects of sense, what Kant called the thing in itself, or in German, the Ding an sich. Ding, the thing, an sich, in itself. The thing in itself. And I think it was McCosh that said that it's a nonsensical thing. How can a thing kind of turn in and be itself? Sort of like he said something to the effect of the whale eating its tail. The ding, the thing in itself, the ding. And Kant made much of this. And that while we may know something about what we sense, we don't know about what it really is in itself, the true nature of it. We may have certain feelings about God, but we don't know what it really is in itself. We don't even know our own consciousness and our own souls in itself, the Ding an sich. Well, this will come into play here in just a moment in my critique of the critique, that it is essentially self-refuting, because Kant says you can't know the Ding an sich, the thing. You can't know the Ding, but then he claimed to have a system that knew everything about the dings out there and to be the final word of things. And speaking of the Ding an sich, let me quote from page 86 of my book, where after considering all these things, and just in order to supposedly solve the perennial problems of human thought, philosophical thought, what is real, here, or here, and how do we interact? How does the consciousness, mind, interact with the physical? How does the mind interact with the metaphysical, the supernatural, the things of supposedly of the spirit? And in order to make his lasting solution that then he would apply to the rest of us for all eternity, Kant had to basically lobotomize us all, to anesthetize us all, to alleviate symptoms, so that we would be nice, bright, shining, happy people for the rest of time, and his utopia, which he spoke about, would eventually come to earth. The new Eden. But not with Adam and Eve like Adam and Eve were. No, he has to lobotomize them first. And what is this ding ultimately? The most real thing, the thing that is the thing in itself. Well, just a few more steps and we will enter Kant's Holy of Holies and find out. As we approach with profound reverence, we recall that, according to Kant and his lexicographers, and here I'm referring to various places in the Critique of Pure Reason, and it's all footnoted. According to Kant, there are no objects without space and time. Space and time do not exist without objects. Apart from conceptual categories, objects do not exist. Concepts and their highest order categories do not exist without objects. Consciousness only arises with objects as synthesized by categories. Objects do not exist without consciousness. The world does not exist unless a mind conceptualizes it. The mind does not exist unless a world is there to be conceptualized. Thus, and this is me speaking, thus we arrive, to Zeno's chagrin, at the ark of the modern humanistic covenant, and with trembling fingers we open the lid, look inside, and find nothing. Well, so what do we say about all of this? I will now do a critique of the critique, and there's many things to critique here. As I alluded to just a moment ago, the critique is self-refuting. Because of the immediate nature of our senses, and because the Ding an sich, that is the ultimate true reality of things, whether in the world or in our minds, the Ding an sich cannot be known, Kant really comes to the final conclusion that nothing can really be known. Yet, he knows enough about the world and the mind and God to declare at the beginning of the critique, I may make bold, and this is quoting Kant at the beginning of the critique in the preface, he says, I may make bold to say that there is not a single metaphysical problem that does not find its solution, or at least the key to its solution here. Thus, in his opinion, his critical philosophy was not something to be scrutinized and critiqued. That's one reason he didn't tell us anything more about the concepts that are in the mind, because it would have brought on objections in his words. No, it's done, it's final, take it or leave it. It is in his words, and implied in his dedication and hat tip to Francis Bacon, who used these words, it's a work to be done, period. But to make this decision, to say this, one would have to know everything. I mean, it'd have to be God. But Kant says that you can't really know anything. And so in this way is the critique of pure reason self-refuting. You can't really know the world. You can't really know the soul. You can't know God. All you can know is these things that are just like machinery. That's another thing William James said. It's just like this Kant has this hodgepodge of machinery. It's a machine shop in there. And he assumes from the start that you really can't know the world through the senses, and God's off limits, and yet he becomes God. And this is, as I've said here, and I'll mention a little bit more here in a minute, it's even this what's going on here is even in the title, The Critique of Pure Reason. At first glance, you think, oh, okay, that Kant is critiquing pure reason. Well, yes, that's true, but it's actually pure reason is doing the critiquing. You see the circular nature of this? Even in the title, it's ambiguous. He's using his conclusions of what pure reason is in order to do this project. And in the end, it comes down to supersubjectivity. And yet he knows enough about everything to say that there's no more to be said. So the critique of pure reason is self-refuting. The critique, my criticism number two, is that the critique of pure reason is an excruciating exercise in circular reasoning. I've already alluded to this. That is, it begs the question big time. And there's a number of ways that you can discern this, but one big way is that he, based on what Hume has taught, he removes God, and then after it's all over, after this, as Ayn Rand said, this hypogyrating on a point, this hypogyrating, he comes to the conclusion that you really, for the good of humanity and the good of philosophy and speculation going forward, you really can't say anything specific about God, but that's where he started. It is circular reasoning. He begs the question right from the start. Okay, and in this way, because Kant has removed God from this, and because he concludes that really there's not much of a world out there to speak of, and there's not much of a God out there to speak of, Kant himself calls his work an entirely negative work or enterprise. He concludes that the God of the Bible cannot seriously be considered for the purposes of philosophy or the purposes of the public good. And he also, later on in the Critique of Pure Reason, he refutes the traditional arguments of God, the cosmological argument, and others. Aristotle, for example, thought that, you could kind of argue your way up to God because you have cause and effect in the world. He observed cause and effect of the world, and therefore that everything has its cause. But you cannot have an infinite count of causes, so it's got to stop somewhere. Aristotle called that a prime mover. Now, his concept of that was sort of an impersonal God, but yet you have this prime mover that started things. But Kant argues that no, because you really don't know what's in the world, and because the cause and effect is just a super subjective human thing that is imposed upon the world, then you can't really say where it goes. You can't say that it stops somewhere and that is God. And Kant argues for that in the Critique of Pure Reason. All right. The Critique of Pure Reason, this is criticism number 3, it's also question-begging in that it concludes that any idea of an external God must be ignored, not only in addition to that, as we've already said, but he also postulates up front that only knowledge that's worthwhile is necessary knowledge, as Kant calls it, a priori knowledge. And this kind of started with, started a long time ago, but René Descartes made a big deal about this, that the knowledge had to be, if we're going to have knowledge and really be sure about things and really then apply that knowledge to the public good, then we got to be so sure about it that it's got to be mathematical, that sure. 1 + 1 = 2. Necessary knowledge. Necessary knowledge that you know even before you sense things in the world. And Kant picks that up and accepts that as a premise that, okay, we're only going to really, in what we're looking for as far as defining really what is worthwhile knowledge, and therefore where the true reality exists here, that we're only going to really consider a priori knowledge. Before what? Sensation knowledge of whether in things in the world or of God. And there's some big time problems with that. By premising this gold standard right up front, Kant invalidates the contingent knowledge by which we view the world around us. And what I'm getting to here is that by saying we can only consider let me say, instead of saying a priori, I say necessary. 1 + 1 = 2 kind of knowledge. Necessary, what is necessarily true. By only counting that as really not valid, worthwhile knowledge, Kant really, from the start, he's already kind of thrown God out, but by doing this, he throws out the whole idea of creature. Okay? You see, God, arguably, this is something Leibniz said, is that God being God, he made everything. He has infinite knowledge of past, present, and whatever will happen in the future. And because of that, God does not, by very definition, doesn't need to learn anything. God knows everything. And so God does not need to sense something in order to learn about it. Everything, in a manner of speaking, if God does sense something, he already knows it perfectly. It's already necessary a priori knowledge. But see, that's God. God made man in his image, but God made man as a limited being, as a finite, and after they fell, a mortal being with limited knowledge. Man is born, well, except for Adam and Eve, but after them, man is born as a baby and must feel the world through the senses and slowly come to a understanding of the purpose of things, the meaning behind things, as Bacon said, the nature of things, and eventually of God. Man has to grope his way there. He has to use his senses and get this synthesis and obtain knowledge a posteriori, in other words, from after sensation, in order to grow up and to be the creature and to develop as God made him to be. In other words, he doesn't wake up one day and all of his knowledge is just a priori. It's just automatically planted in there. So, but by Kant saying, no, we're only going to consider a priori knowledge, what he does, he throws out right from the beginning the whole notion of creature. So, God is already gone, creature is gone, and Kant is going to move all this into here. In actuality, he just vaporizes world, God, and all you're left with is man and his a priori knowledge, which does what? It makes man God. Well, is man God? I get up in the morning and I think, I didn't make myself. I have no idea of what I was, if I was anything, before I was born. I certainly didn't make myself. I don't know how I was made. Even here after 65 years of life, I still don't hardly know anything about my body. What's in that cell at the end of my fingernail? I know absolutely nothing about it. But God does. I can barely tie my shoelaces in the morning, but God made the universe. So, in this way, I believe the critique of pure reason is flawed. And let me say once again that it's tricky to pull this out of Kant because he's very evasive, just in general. Remember, the world that he's arguing in and making his case is the world that he concludes is how it really is. Therefore, throughout the whole line of argumentation of the critique, it's subject an object is completely confused. You really don't know what he's talking about. When it's to his advantage to make you think that it's the subject he's talking about, then he'll do that. But when it's his advantage to say, even using the same sentence, no, it's the object I'm talking about. Well, he can do that. He can do that because in his world, subject and object are the same. All right, criticism number 4. The critique of pure reason is largely unreadable. And especially in the heart of it there, which he acknowledges is the heart where he develops his list of the categories, and then he justifies them by this transcendental deduction. You can tell by what Kantian scholars say regarding this that the emperor has no clothes. Most of them don't dare go there and really try to flesh out what Kant really means and take his steps of argumentation step by step and show what he really means. A few I've seen make an attempt at that, but it ends up descending into gibberish, if just for the very reason that you don't know really when he's talking about the subject, it's maybe really the object, or vice versa. But the critique of pure reason is largely unreadable. And this is a fact not just noticed by me, but over the years, many of others have noticed it, both great and small. Professor Daniel Robinson at Oxford, for example, who I think was at Oxford, called the critique of pure reason, quote, the most intractable, the most Byzantine treatise in the entire philosophical canon, unquote. Ayn Rand, the objectivist philosopher back a couple of generations, called the critique of pure reason unintelligible, a mess, in her words, that would paralyze a reader's critical faculty, a mess of evasions, equivocations, obfuscations, circumlocutions, non sequiturs, endless sentences leading nowhere, etc. And as I said in the introduction, Kant's friend Marcus Hertz, Kant wanted him to review his initial draft of the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant, who was a student Hertz, who was a friend but also a student of Kant, returned it half unread and said if he went any farther, he'd go insane. Those were his words. He wanted to avoid insanity. And even Kant's admirer and translator and commentator Norman Kemp Smith, who was at Princeton for some time, confessed this, quote, the Critique of Pure Reason is more obscure and difficult than even a metaphysical treatise has any right to be. The difficulties are not merely due to defects of exposition. They, in fact, multiply rather than diminish upon detailed study. Now think about that. The problems of what Kant means multiply upon detailed study. That means if you really study it closely, the meaninglessness of it multiplies to where it just cannot be overcome. In Kant's argumentation, in his metaphysical deduction, trying to account for, to show that these concepts, of which the highest order are the categories, are really in the human mind, and they really do show us that for all intents and purposes, the reality of the things of sense is not really there, but really in here. In Kant's deduction or his justification for that, just as a little analogy, I pull this mathematical equation. I don't know if it's a real mathematical equation, Estevan will show it there on the screen. But you have something like this massively lengthy and complicated mathematical equation, and Kant's deduction is kind of like that. You go, wait a minute, what? Who really understands that? But the problem with Kant is that the definitions aren't really defined, and then you have this ambiguity between the subject and object, and the Kant scholars will tell you, some of them, that really they're not really sure what he means about that. And yet, this is the basis of our Western society, this wall of separation, and indirectly, by the way, the Berlin Wall, which was finally brought down because communism is a result of this. All this one. Everybody's got to be one, because the world of our experience is all one world. It's a projection that we make. Okay, my critique number 5 of the critique is its limited terminology. The critique's limited terminology can in no way describe the fantastically complex processes of the human mind and how it connects with the world of sensation. Throughout the vital part of the critique that I have focused on, the same 20 or so words are constantly repeated and rearranged. And this is something I noticed early on. I said, wait a minute, I smelled a rodent here. Kant goes on, at least in this vital section, that he admits is the core of his work that justifies everything else. This deduction of the categories of the understanding, as he says, in which he basically argues that all the concepts of the world, and what is implied here is not just every concept, right down to the details, are already in the mind. But yet, in order to do that, to know the mind that well, the mind and all that it does, all its knowledge and happiness and contingency of things and skepticism and gullibility, and I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and then how that can interact with the world and God. To boil that down to the same 20 or so words that he uses over and over. He's like somebody with a Lego set that he puts these Legos together and then tears it apart, starts putting them back together again, tears it apart, putting them back together. Words like intuition, concept, category, representation, idea, the word transcendental, Ding an sich, thing in itself, perception, phenomenon, apperception, or self-consciousness, understanding, manifold, principle, rule. That one word alone drives you nuts. Time and time again, he says that this manifold that is connected to this intuition that does such and such through the apperception is according to a rule. According to a rule. According to what rule is he talking about? He never clarifies it. According to a rule. Synthesize. And there's a few more words in there, but he uses these words over and over and over again. It's like trying to describe a Boeing 747 with its pilots in there, and who have a knowledge of how to get from LA to Istanbul, and the whole jet with everything, all its inner complex electrical and hydraulic and fuel and propulsion complexity, and as if somebody comes along and tries to exhaustively tell us about that 747 and the intention of its pilots and where they're going by the use of 20 words, like wing, cockpit, skin, aileron, cargo, windshield, seat, and then just to use those words to describe the whole thing, and then to say this is the final word, and there'll be no more speculation about this in the future. Well, that's kind of an analogy of what Kant does. Of course, it's an impossibility. My criticism number 6. The critique's limited terminology. It's bad enough that there's only these few words that he parrots over and over and over again. But worse yet, these words are either poorly or not defined at all in the Critique of Pure Reason, and in fact appear to have a range of meanings. Because there are all but no definitions, and because Kant refuses to offer anything that may help readers get the picture of what he means, like, giving examples or analogies or illustrations or some kind of picture. Actually, when I was reading Kant, I tried to sort of make a picture what he's talking about, where the intuitions are plug into a representation, which then goes to the human mind, etc. But because Kant does not give us definitions, and as I recall, he actually says that he intentionally does not give us definitions. I might be wrong about that. But because he does that, the critique rests, and I'm going to quote Ayn Rand here, the critique rests on, quote, on a zero, the absence of definitions. And the exasperated last godly president of Yale College, Noah Porter, said this about this defect. He said, "There is no disguising the fact that Kant's terminology is always technical in the extreme and sometimes absolutely barbarous." Unquote. And this problem is magnified by the fact that inasmuch as there are definitions, Kant's few terms that Kant uses over and over again are defined, if they are defined in terms, they're defined in terms relative to each other, or in terms of each other. And of course, this results in terms instability, which again is a byproduct of the overall tendency of the Critique of Pure Reason to confuse subject and object, which itself is a consequence of the critical philosophies. That is that's what he called his philosophy, the critical philosophy. The critical philosophy's constant cat and mouse game regarding the origin of the objects of sensation. Now, this instability of Kant's terms, that you don't really know what he's talking about, and I just had this thought that, there's something called structuralism. Later philosophers that drew on Kant would go and say that, you can't know anything about things said in language because every word depends on other words for their meaning, etc. And it's just more of this idea that you can't know anything. But as far as the instability of the terms that Kant uses, their instability is blaringly put on display by Kant's lexicographers. In other words, those who write these lexicons of Kant's terminology, The one I perused was by a man named, Dr. Howard Cagill, who I think is or was an English philosopher over in England, and where the definition of these terms, like for example representation or category or understanding or rule, as each one of these are defined, the definitions for just one of them will run to several pages. And at least in the case of this one, lexicographer, Dr. Cagill, he admits up front that this is a sort of his best attempt, that in fact Kant's terms are he used a really weird word for it that I forgot to write down here, but basically that they you can't tie them down to what they really mean. Well, then what good is it? What good is this book if he's trying to explain exhaustively what is, but his terms don't have meaning? So that's another flaw. All right, criticism number 7. So with Kant, you don't really know what is what. As I said before, the very title of the Critique of Pure Reason is ambiguous. And Kant uses the world of his conclusion, in other words, this confused world where everything is in the mind of man and there is no subject and object, but he uses it in the process of his investigation. He ostensibly sets out to investigate pure reason, but he actually uses his concluded view of pure reason to do the investigation. And that's why I said the critique of pure reason is smoke and mirrors. At least I say that in my book. Smoke and mirrors. It's like being in a house of horrors. You don't know if it's an image of yourself or something else. You hear screams and shrieks, but you don't know if it's coming from your own self or they're really out there. And it's all because the subject and object is confused in the mind of Kant. Finally, and I've alluded to this before, if Kant is right, and all of our knowledge really is a priori, then doesn't that make us God? You know, as I stated a little while ago, God does not need to sense anything to know everything. All knowledge to God is a priori. He knows it immediately. He's the creator of the universe. But we, as his hapless creatures, we have to learn things. It's not a priori knowledge. That's why God gave us noses, eyes to see and ears to hear, so that we might learn something about the world and might survive in the world, and along the way, learn things about God's creation and about God. I just had the thought that, much what we learn about God is through the testimony of others who have had first-hand experiences with God, like Moses, David, Jesus Christ. So Kant obliterates the notion of creature, but because we're left, he makes everything a priori in the mind of man. And now Kant did not come out and say this, but his immediate followers took the ball and ran with it, especially in Johann Fichte, and then Hegel. Hegel and the Hegelian philosophy that followed that, which very much denivized man, and because man is history, the whole history of the world, and then resulted in this mad ultra-nationalism of the Prussian German people, thinking that history is the divine working itself out in the most powerful men and thinkers, and of course that was the Germans. And well, they got a taste of reality in World War I and then in World War II, sadly. But millions died in the process under that, and also under the communist horror under Trotsky and or Lenin to start with there in Russia during the revolution there, and which resulted in Stalinism. I mean, if all reality is in the mind, then everything is one. It's all there. It's not really here. It's just all here. And Stalin thought, okay, you know, whatever I think, that's right. And he ordered the death of millions. And some people want to impose that on the world even today, even despite that how the ultra-nationalism of the Germans, and then the Nazism that came after that, and communism has been discredited by, as Christ said, by your fruits you will know them. And yet there are many people in the world that are still trying to take us in that direction. But it all comes back to the, what the devil said to Eve in the garden. Did God really say? And Eve kind of liked it. Did God? Yeah, we'll just put God over there, and that way I can do what I want. All right. So in the next scene, we'll give a brief conclusion to all this, but I'm glad you've stuck with me up to this point, and we'll make the conclusion brief, and I hope it will be a help to you as you step out into the world of ideas, the real world of ideas, and also help you contemplate that, there is somebody who made this world and does have an ultimate meaning, and our lives are not meaningless, but they are meaningful. There is a purpose in this life. And thankfully, the word of Immanuel Kant is not the last word. Professor Paul Guyer, one of the leading Kant scholars, said this about the Critique of Pure Reason. To tell the whole story of the book's influence would be to write the history of philosophy since Kant. Here Guyer makes him almost out to be like Plato, who people have said are all of Western philosophy since the time of Plato is a footnote to him. So, between what Guyer says and many others, Kant is obviously a very important person. Kant himself said that he had solved all the previous problems with human reason. He had solved them to, quote, perfect satisfaction. Not exactly in keeping with the spirit of Socrates, is it? And that his critical philosophy, that is from the Critique of Pure Reason, would be a, quote, tribunal of eternal and unchangeable laws. And regarding this tribunal, Kant said, there is nothing, however useful, however sacred it may be, and he's including religion there, however sacred it may be, that can claim exemption from the searching examination of this supreme tribunal. So, Immanuel Kant obviously thought a lot of his program. And I don't know how much Socrates would have enjoyed the fact that Kant believed that he had solved all problems, metaphysical and otherwise, for all time, and that everybody since his time would have to abide by his system. Question is, was he right? His system, which is really the tribunal, is that pours all reality of the world of God and everything else into the human mind. Was he right? Well, it's interesting, the things he said, and really nothing that new. The ancients had thought about this, that maybe there's some forms or the furniture of the mind that are automatically within us that help us make sense of the world. Kant spoke about time, which, yes, does indeed seem quite subjective, and space, that it does seem to be, that space otherwise being arguably nothing, that it is all in the mind. And then Kant talks about these categories, which are the highest general things that can be said about everything. Well, okay, maybe so. And then he took it a step further and spoke about how all this is schematized through our consciousness, through self-consciousness, something Kant called apperception. But isn't this just a matter of being human? I mean, being human means we are awake, we are aware, we are self-aware, we are aware of at least the concept of God and our mortality, and perhaps the chance that we will be judged by God someday. And so these things in the mind, these concepts and intuitions that Kant calls them, it just seems to be a part of being human. But you see, Kant does not allow humanness as we know it. Maybe better to say being a creature. Kant does not allow us to be a creature from the beginning because he removes God. He disallows God for factoring in as knowledge from the beginning. So if there's no transcendent creator, then there's no creature. But when Kant moves virtually the creation and any concept of God into the mind, now he turns the creature into the creator. And this is the great flaw, the great black hole, the great baffling question of Kant. Yes, we do have perhaps these concepts of time and space and the categories, and we are self-aware, et cetera, et cetera. But then how does he take that? And then he gets from that all else is a product of the mind. I can look at anything. I can look at this book, the Critique of Pure Reason that's in my hands, and I can say, okay, it's there. It has some kind of substance. It has certain properties, brownness, ductility, et cetera, and that if I drop it, it causes something else to happen. But okay, fine. That is my perception of my special perception of this book. If I were a dog, then maybe this perception would be a little bit different, and it would be in black and white. I could say the same things about the goose over here. But how does all that get the book into my mind? How does all that mean that this book or the goose is a product of my mind, that I create these things? Well, that's Kant's great question that I don't think he solves. Now, he does seem to make an attempt to go this way, that really the book, the goose, whatever, is a product of the mind, and it has to do a lot about our self-awareness, our consciousness. And that apart from our consciousness of things, those things for us don't exist. And so we're back to the question of, if a tree falls in the woods and there's nobody there to hear it, or if a goose honks and there's nobody there to hear it, then it doesn't exist. And I have to admit, there's something compelling about that. When I ponder the possibility of everything out there in the universe, the physical universe, existing apart from no mind to perceive it, it just makes the things in the universe seem to be so pointless, so breathtakingly meaningless, that it's hard to imagine. But see, there's a way out there that Kant doesn't allow at the beginning, because he does not allow God at the beginning. He does not allow the possibility that even if there were no other minds, especially human minds out in the universe, to perceive it and be aware of it, that at least you would have God there who made the universe to perceive it. Well, you know, the words of Charles Charles Hodge. The words of Charles Hodge come back to me, who taught at Princeton Seminary in the mid-1800s, just as the influence of Kant and Fichte and Hegel and the German idealism was being felt in America for the first time. And Hodge called it the German insanity. And that resonates with me. It has created many problems in the world. Just after it came on the scene, especially as it was filtered through Georg Hegel in the early 1800s, this notion that all reality all comes out of the mind aided and abetted the hyper-German nationalism that resulted in the great expansion of the Prussian state and then the unification of Germany under Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, and the whole generation there of Eisen und Blut, of iron and blood, which then resulted in World War I. In the course of that, millions died. And then what Kant taught, as filtered through Hegel, and then on through Ludwig Feuerbach, and then Karl Marx. Kant, arguably, and this is generally acknowledged, was the worldview ancestor of Marxism and communism. And communists killed literally, upwards of tens, maybe hundreds of millions of their own people. And now we have many terrible things going on. When you believe in the God out there and His Word, there's a sense that, hey, that God can judge me someday. So when that God says, "Thou shalt not kill," we might take that pretty seriously. But the God within, what authority does the God within have? And that's where Kant says all sense of morality comes from, the human mind, the God within. Well, what authority does that God have? And so when that God has a sense of "thou shalt not kill," which Kant doesn't deny, how much force does it have? So people today, when their sexual passions take over, they justify sexual hedonism of all kinds and the resultant abortion slaughter, which kills literally untold millions of babies in the womb. And now this self-godism has gotten so bad that especially as what is taught in our universities, because a lot of this comes through the universities that are under the grip of the tribunal. Now if a boy thinks he's a girl, then he's really a girl. Or if a girl thinks he's a boy, then she's really a boy. I agree with Hodge. This is indeed madness. Now I know in conclusion that few, if any, professors that teach in universities and colleges that benefit from being in this closed system of enforcing the tribunal, very few will be changed, have a change of heart by what I say. But to you students who are going into classes, especially philosophy classes, especially classes where, like in beginning philosophy, where Kant is invariably a part of what is taught there. I want you to do a couple of things. When your professor is talking about time and space and the categories as being justification that we essentially create the world in our own image, as Professor Geyer said, raise your hand and ask, well, can you give me more information about these categories? I mean, are they just concepts, general concepts about things that, yes, seem to be cerebral, but what about all the things? Yes, the goose has a certain substance and is a single unit among others and may cause something, but how do these categories tell us something about the goose? How does the goose get into our consciousness? And then another question that you might ask is related to that, is just after this exposition of Kant and the critique of pure reason is finished, how does the whole world get into our minds? And how in the world could we create that? How in the world does synthetic knowledge become analytic knowledge? Or to put it another way, how does what is sensed a posteriori all become a priori? Or to put it in English, how is what is sensed after sensation, after the sensation, become as if it were sensed before sensation? Because, you know, it seems like a contradiction. And I want you to ponder, as I said at the beginning, that if this tribunal, which comes from this book, The Critique of Pure Reason, if what is taught here cuts you off from this, cuts you off from God and the fact that God created, but man does evil, but God sent his only begotten Son. He loved mankind so much, his creation, that he sent Christ so that whosoever might believe on him would not perish but be saved. That God sent Christ to save us, to be a means out of the mayhem and the death of this world. If Kant cuts you off from this, then you better be sure of what Kant says, that his argumentation is clear, and you're clear in your own mind that he has justified his case plainly through a reasonable chain of argumentation. If he doesn't, then please don't throw this away, because your eternal lives depend on it. Thank you for remaining with me during this video series, and may God bless you. If you're students, may God bless you and give you wisdom in your studies, and may God open your minds to the truth. Thank you.